We are about 9 weeks now out from Advent, which means we're about 13 weeks out from Christmas this morning. And Advent, as I'm sure you're well aware, it's a time of preparation. It's a time of getting ready for the arrival of Jesus. We're making room in our hearts and minds for him again, which is ironic because it kind of falls in at the time of year where we're probably the most busy and the least likely to be doing exactly that, to actually have the space to do it. And so I'm declaring with executive powers an early Advent in our church this morning, so that when those end-of-year functions start populating your calendar and you're trying to figure out where you're going to find time for anything, and when you're walking through the mall and you realize everything is red and green and gold and Jingle Bells is playing and you're singing along to it, it won't be a shock. There'll be no excuses because you heard it back here, 21st of September, that Jesus is on his way. And so to do all of that, we're going to be, and Izzy, if we could just chuck the slides up on the back, we're going to be spending a little bit of time in what would be probably, at least in my top two, maybe my top one, desert island books of the Bible, as in if I was stuck on a desert island and hypothetically, for some reason, I could only bring one book of the Bible along with me. I'm not sure how that would be a thing. John's Gospel would probably be it. And I guess it is it for me because it is just so rich and so deep. I was reading one writer this week who said that John soars as an eagle over more pedestrian depictions of the life of Christ, by which they mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke, three other Gospels. And I guess you're in a good place when one book forces the description of three books of the Bible as being pedestrian by comparison. John also stands alone to a certain degree. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're all kind of borrowing from the same tradition. And John has a little bit of overlap. There are a few major stories, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus being anointed, the crucifixion and resurrection. But the bigger stories in John are largely separate. And so there's sort of like this other kind of quality to it. It kind of stands apart a little bit and it makes it special. Matthew's interested in tying Jesus into whakapapa, into tradition, into kind of the sense of who he is in light of where he's come from. Mark, when you read it, it's like Jesus shows up, he's just straight into the action, it's kind of bang, 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 and off he goes. Luke, it's a carefully researched account to give confidence in the historical reality of Jesus. And John, as well, is written with its own clear direction. And it actually isn't announced right at the start. It comes right down near the end in the second to last chapter. John chapter 20, verse 31. These, as in everything that's written in John, is written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John is written to lift our eyes a little bit higher to the story of Jesus, to draw us into the story of Jesus, to find life within it, to kind of be reminded again of the richness and the depth of this tradition that we are all a part of. And we get a sense of that in where we're starting today in the 18 verses that form something of the introduction, kind of the prologue for John's Gospel, which sets us up for everything that comes on. And rather than reading through most of it, we're going to watch it in the form of a video that Carolyn did an awesome job of editing together this week. So if we could chuck that up, Izzy. Thank you.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And with this Word, God created all things.
Nothing was made without the Word.
Everything that was created
Received its life from him.
and his life gave light to everyone.
The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has never put it out.
So, where our passage begins today, in the beginning. And right away, just kind of 3 words in, John is telling us to sit up and pay attention. It's like if you went and picked up a book, and the book had a blank cover, and you turned to the first page, and it said this: when Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11th birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Like, a reasonable amount of us would probably know immediately what story we're in, right? Especially here in Aotearoa, with 25 years worth of Lord of the Rings related tourism, and a real deal Hobbiton, just down the road as well. And what John is doing here is likewise about using language that is familiar to help us understand where we are, because those words in the beginning, if we know our Bibles, then we know these words. We know what story we're in because, well, this is how the Bible starts. In the beginning. In Genesis 1:1. Just like Bilbo and Bag End and Hobbiton draw us into the world of Tolkien, so in the beginning helps to situate us in the story again this morning as well. It pulls our minds back into this wider picture, into the story of Genesis, of this big God, powerful beyond our comprehension, who flings a trillion stars into space and whose hands give shape to the earth. And then wider than that, because John's audience were familiar with the Jewish texts, and so the mind might wander forward into the other aspects of that big God story, the God who breathes life into the dust of the ground, who creates out of love in his own image, the God who partners with his creation for the blessing of the earth, the God who, even when that creation, when we headed off in a different direction, still in love shows up again and again and again. We're talking about that big God. And in just 3 words, John is enveloping the entirety of the Old Testament tradition and inviting us back into this wider picture again, a history, a long story, a big story of God's work in our world. 3 words which call us back and kind of remind us of everything that has come before. And so if the first 3 words are kind of about drawing us back, then the next 3 words, they're kind of about something new. They set the stage for something that is to come. In the beginning, writes John, was the Word. And we know back in Genesis that within kind of like 3 verses, God is speaking words, and that his words, they speak creation into existence. And God said, let there be light. And God said, let the land produce vegetation. And God said, let us make humankind in our image. His words are filled with power, not just noise. When God speaks, then things happen. Psalmist writes in Psalm 29, the voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the desert. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forest bare. And here is John taking that voice, those words and applying it to a being, from words to the Word. The Word was with God and the Word was God, John says. John is saying that everything that could be said about that big and awesome and all-powerful God way back in the beginning can equally be said about this Word. Just as the big God at the start of the Bible is a God of life and light, so is the Word, writes John. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And all of this is kind of building up to this big idea, which we didn't see in the video, but just follows on after it. In John 1, 14 and 15, the Word then became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory. The language is picking up this beautiful imagery from the Old Testament of the tent where God's resting place was at the heart of the people as they camped out in the wilderness and moved from place to place. This tent called the tabernacle, it was the place of meeting between the people and God. It's where he made his home. And so John borrows that word and he says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled here with us, and made his home, set up his tent. Perhaps as one more contemporary author says, he moved into our neighborhood. He moved into this community. He moved into these streets. The big God from the beginning, unimaginable, unseeable, now visible. Reach out and touch it, reality. Here he is with us. This is, in the prologue, I guess it's John's Christmas story. But it's a long way from donkeys and from mangers and from shepherds. John takes a big step back and he asks us to see again the big picture and to understand the significance of all of it, to tie that baby, the baby Jesus, into the very words which speak life and light into existence. The distant and the unknowable has become close and real. Right out of high school, one of Alyssa's youngest brother went overseas for a gap year in England to teach in a high school. And while he was there, he would occasionally take trips into London and spend time staying there in the home of some of our family friends. In fact, I think all of Alyssa's siblings, apart from Alyssa, enjoyed the privilege of staying there at one time or another. The only thing that was a little bit different about this particular place in London is that to get into their home, you had to go through a security gate to get into it, and there were guards standing there that wanted to examine all of your paperwork. And the sign on the front said Kensington Palace on it, because one of these friends was in service to the royal family. And so Prince William and the Duchess of Cambridge were kind of far off and distant and unknowable. But then Wills and Kate got a little bit more airtime in the family chat during those London weekends as we heard accounts of the eye contact that was made as they drove past the house in the morning, or the time that another one of Alyssa's brothers was walking in the garden and was asked to step aside by security as he came across Kate out walking there. From distant and unreachable and unknowable to flesh and blood and close at hand. Wills and Kate moving in next door, getting their coffee at Ruby Red, out mowing the grass yesterday while the sun was shining. And this would be like a great illustration, I guess, if it wasn't for the fact that it doesn't even come close to a glimmer of the reality. Perhaps better, we wake up tomorrow and the headlines say that the royal family have relocated to Gaza, or they've relocated to Myanmar, or to the Ukrainian front, or to northern Sudan. And even then, that would be an utterly insufficient image for the scandal and the reality that is being expressed here at the start of John's Gospel. The God over all things made his way all the way down to a home in a rural community amidst an oppressed people living under military rule. A big God, bigger than anything we can imagine, who becomes close and real in the person of Jesus. It's how John concludes his prologue, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So I guess just very simply, two ideas to hold on to this morning in this introduction to John's Gospel. There's a reminder of a big God, and a reminder that that big God does become small and makes his home among us. And I guess it's in my mind to ask then how those two ideas might meet us right where we are sitting here today. How might those ideas move into our reality? I wonder how the bigness of God might be a welcome perspective for you today. I know for me, as I've got older, I've kind of needed God to get bigger and bigger in my mind. You know, as creation groans, as the news gets worse, as grown-up responsibilities and worries kind of fill the space, I've needed a God who is big enough for some of those questions. I've needed a God who's big enough for the unknowns. I've needed a God who is big enough for our problems, for the problems in our world right now that seem so far beyond human ability to solve. I need a God who is big enough in order for there to be some kind of meaningful hope for us to hold on to. You know, John pulls us into the story this morning, this Jesus story, and reminds us in three words that we aren't dealing with a God who is limited in the ways that we are. A God who can see and understand far more than we can. A God who is bigger, who is much, much bigger than anything that we happen to have in front of us right now. You know, who are we talking about when we're talking about God? We're talking about the life speaker. We're talking about the light speaker, the one who knit, you know, every fiber of our beings together, every fiber of this reality together. That's the God of the story that we're being drawn into in John. And so a question sort of sits there this morning, you know, is your idea of who God is sufficient for entering into this gospel again over the next few weeks? Is your idea of God big enough? Is your idea of God big enough as you look out at the world, as you walk into Monday and all the challenges of the week? Is your idea of God big enough for all of that? Can you trust him with what's in front of you? And then, I guess along with the bigness, there's this other beautiful idea of God who comes and sets up a tent among us, who moves into this neighborhood. What might it mean to know again today that where you are, God is right there with you as well? What might it mean to know that in love, Jesus moves into our world, that God moves into your world, into the nitty-gritty reality, into your problems, into your complexity, into your worry, into your grief, into your doubts, also into your joy, into your loves, into your springtime sun yesterday. You know, God becomes small to walk with us amongst all of it. Can you hear that again this morning for the encouragement that it is? God is with you. God is present. In that situation where you're feeling overwhelmed right now, God is there. In that space where you worry, where you're feeling alone, God is there. He is with you. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into Mangere Bridge. You know, what might it look like to live as if that was true? Because surely in the promise of the Spirit of the risen Christ, it is true for us today. So an encouragement in that as well, but perhaps also a model for us. You know, God's journey of becoming small, it doesn't finish in that form of, you know, the Christmas baby Jesus in a manger, but rather down the other end of Jesus' life. Another follower of Jesus writes a little later on, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. The path that Jesus walks is down. Jesus walks down into love, down into humility, down into costly service, and he calls those who follow him into that path as well. And that is an incredibly relevant thing to be reminded of, I think, individually, but perhaps also corporately as the church in this particular moment in time. There's been a lot of division and sadness in our news over the last couple of weeks. And we've got to be clear this morning that God's, means of changing the world, it doesn't come through the power that we covet. It doesn't come through the politics that we worship. It's not in right-leaning politics. It's not in left-leaning politics. It's not in conservative politics. It's not in liberal politics. It's not in any of that stuff. God's means of changing the world is in subverting the brokenness of that dynamic that we live within. In turning upside down all of that stuff that we've seen written large in our news over these last couple of weeks. You know, that us and them stuff, our side, their side. I mean, God forbid you log into Facebook, it's just all over there. To buy into that stuff is to fail to recognize that in doing so we are only contributing personally to the same cycle of division and violence that is carrying on in our world. And we hear today that the life and the light of God enters into our reality in the form of humility and service. It gives away power, it gives away status, it gives up the need to win in order that, and we'll see it as John progresses, that all people of lots of different perspectives and different lifestyles and different ethnicities would be drawn into this big story of God's love and life. And I just want to say that I think we as the church, and that's Big C Church, because I think we're pretty good in this church here, but Big C Church, I think we can do better with this stuff. We must do better in following the example of Jesus again in our time to lead us into a better way. And so, in the beginning, a big God, big enough for us, big enough for our stuff, big enough for anything that you have in front of you this morning. Can you trust him with what's sitting there with you? A big God who moves in next door, just over the fence, hanging out the washing, mowing the grass. What would happen if you started to live with that imagination? What would happen if you started to cultivate that and practice that as a discipline to look for where that God was at work in your world? A God whose example we're called to follow in, to let go of our own power, to diminish ourselves in order that we might join the same purpose for which this wonderful gospel was written. That yet others may see and believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, and through believing may also have life in his name. Amen.